When I found out my wife was cheating, I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I smiled, because I already knew exactly how I was going to destroy her life. Hey everyone, welcome back and thanks for being here with me today. I've got a new story to share, and it's one that still shakes me every time I think about it. So let's get into it. For a long time, I honestly believed I was living a dream life. My wife, Emily, and I had built a warm, cozy home in a peaceful little neighborhood. We had our routines, our inside jokes, and those small traditions that make life feel secure. Matching coffee mugs in the cupboard, Friday night movies on the couch, and weekends spent digging in our little backyard garden. Friends and neighbors would often tell us how lucky we were, saying we looked like the perfect couple. I used to smile and agree, feeling proud. But now, those same compliments echo in my head with a strange emptiness. Because here's the truth, perfection is a mirage. And I didn't see the hairline cracks starting to run through what I thought was a solid foundation. Or maybe, deep down, I just didn't want to see them. Emily worked in marketing, which meant lots of travel, conferences, client meetings, team events. I'd gotten used to holding down the fort while she was away. I trusted her without question. Why wouldn't I? She wasn't just my wife, she was my best friend, my sounding board, the person I believed would always have my back. I had my steady job managing a supply chain team, nothing glamorous, but it was stable and it allowed me to be home most evenings. I admired her drive and charisma. She could light up a room while I was perfectly content to stay on the sidelines, blending into the background. I thought those differences balanced us out. I thought they made us stronger. But in the months before everything fell apart, little changes started creeping in. Emily began coming home later, first by 30 minutes, then an hour, then sometimes well past midnight. I told myself it was just her job, that she was chasing deadlines or dealing with demanding clients. But there were other signs I couldn't quite explain away, the way she'd keep her phone glued to her hand, smiling at messages she wouldn't share with me, laughing softly at something I wasn't a part of. When I asked, she always had an easy answer, work stuff, or just the girls chatting. And I chose to believe her. Or maybe I needed to believe her. Still, there were moments, quick, almost invisible, when a faint, uneasy thought would stir in my mind. I'd brush it off, but it kept coming back. One night, it was around 2 a.m, I woke up thirsty. I slipped out of bed quietly so I wouldn't disturb her and padded down the hallway toward the kitchen. As I walked past the living room, a faint bluish glow caught my eye. It was Emily's phone sitting on the coffee table. She must have forgotten it there. At first, I barely registered it, just one of those little things you notice and move on. But the longer I stood there, the more that soft light seemed to pull at me. I knew it was wrong. I knew I had no right to go through her things. But something in me, curiosity, fear, maybe even a quiet whisper of intuition, kept me rooted in place. It felt almost as if the moment had been placed in my path on purpose, like I was being handed an answer to a question I hadn't dared ask. I picked up her phone. My thumb hovered over the screen, hesitating for just a second. She had always trusted me with her passcode, never once imagining I might actually use it. That trust, the unspoken bond we had, was the only thing keeping me from unlocking it. But in the end, I told myself I was only going to take a quick look, just to make sure everything was fine. The first notification that popped up wasn't from work. It was a text from someone named Ethan. Can't stop thinking about you. Last night was amazing. My heart seemed to stop mid-beat. My hand trembled so violently I nearly dropped the phone. The room seemed to fade away like the air had been sucked out. All I could hear was the pounding of my own pulse in my ears. Last night was amazing. The words burned into my mind. What exactly did that mean? I clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, there was some innocent explanation. A misunderstanding, a poorly worded joke. I scrolled up. I shouldn't have. I wish I hadn't. The more I read, the heavier the weight in my chest became. Late night rendezvous. Strings of romantic emojis. Inside jokes I'd never heard before. Their words weren't just flirtatious, they carried the tone of two people who shared a private world. This wasn't some fleeting mistake. It wasn't just a physical betrayal. It was something deeper. Something emotional. I carefully placed the phone back on the table exactly as I'd found it. Then I just stood there staring out the dark window. The reality of what I had just uncovered seeped into me slowly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Questions began to tumble through my head in an endless loop. Who was Ethan? How long had this been happening? How many nights had she looked me in the eye and told me nothing was wrong? I stayed in that living room for hours, sitting in silence, my mind replaying scenes from our marriage like an old film reel. I thought about the mornings when she'd stopped kissing me goodbye. The sudden appearance of lingerie I'd never seen before. Little things I'd brushed off at the time now screamed for my attention. I thought back to things I'd brushed off before, how she'd suddenly signed up for a gym membership when she'd never shown interest before, how her girls' nights out had started happening more often. At the time, none of it seemed strange. Now, each one stood out like a glaring warning sign I had chosen not to see. It all connected now. The timeline, the changes in her behavior, the subtle ways she'd pulled away from me. But the sharpest cut wasn't the affair itself, it was realizing just how blind I had been. I had poured my trust into her without hesitation, given her my loyalty, my devotion, and in return, she had used it as cover for her betrayal. When the first light of morning crept through the blinds, the raw sting of heartbreak began to change into something heavier, something more dangerous. It wasn't the explosive, shouting kind of anger, it was colder, sharper. A controlled fury that sat quietly inside me like a blade being sharpened. And it wasn't just directed at Emily. I was furious with myself, for being so trusting, so naive, for letting myself live in a bubble of denial. She came downstairs not long after, humming softly, hair still a little messy from sleep. She smiled at me like nothing had changed and asked if I wanted pancakes for breakfast. Her eyes were warm, casual, completely unaware of the storm building right in front of her. I studied her face in a way I hadn't in years. This was the woman I had loved, the one I had built my life with. But in that moment I realized something chilling. She didn't see me as a threat. She saw me as safe, harmless, someone easy to deceive. That was her mistake. Because Emily had no idea who I used to be before the quiet life, before the routines, before I had decided to be a man who trusted without question. And she was about to find out. I knew I couldn't just explode and demand answers. That would be sloppy. Revenge, real revenge, took patience, planning, precision. I needed evidence so clear, so undeniable, that there would be no way for her to twist the truth. No denials. No lies to hide behind. So that morning I slipped into a role. I smiled, ate the pancakes she set in front of me, even kissed her on the cheek before heading out the door. From the outside, I was the same husband I'd always been. Inside, I was seething. The image of Emily smiling at her phone, laughing at Ethan's messages, was etched into my mind like a scar. But I forced myself to push it aside. This wasn't the time to feel, it was the time to act. By the time my lunch break rolled around, I decided I needed help, real professional help. That afternoon, I reached out to a private investigator I'd found online. His name was Dale, and his reviews painted him as someone who not only got results, but knew how to stay invisible while doing it. We met later that evening in a small corner booth at a quiet coffee shop. I told him everything, how I'd stumbled onto the messages, the way Emily had been acting, and my need for proof so undeniable it couldn't be talked away. I want everything, I told him. Photos, texts, locations, anything that will erase all doubt. Dale listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. Then a sly grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Discreet is my middle name," he said calmly. "You'll have what you need before you know it." The days that followed crawled by like weeks. Emily moved through her routines with the same ease and charm as always, laughing, chatting with friends, even telling me about a business trip she had planned for the weekend. My stomach tightened when she mentioned it, because I already suspected exactly who she'd be spending that time with. Still, I kept my face neutral, my voice steady. "Not yet." 3 days later, Dale called me. "Jack, you were right," he said, his tone heavier now. "I've got everything. Photos, timestamps, the whole package." We met that evening at his small office. He laid a folder on the desk in front of me and slid it over. The moment I opened it, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. There she was, Emily, walking arm in arm into a high-end downtown hotel with Ethan. The images were crisp, dated, and time-stamped. Next came screenshots of their conversations, long strings of texts filled with private jokes, romantic emojis, and detailed plans for their weekend getaway. There was no ambiguity. This wasn't a careless fling, it was something carefully maintained, something that had been alive far longer than I'd allowed myself to imagine. I stared at the evidence for a long time, letting each image burn itself into my memory. And as I did, something inside me shifted. The sadness, the heartbreak, it all began to drain away, replaced by a cold clarity. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't feel the urge to throw anything across the room. No, instead I began to think. Every betrayal deserves consequences. And now, I had everything I needed to make sure Emily and Ethan faced theirs. She had no idea what she'd started. The plan I'd been quietly building in my head was now ready, every detail in place. And the best part? She still thought I was the same harmless man she'd been deceiving all along. Her life, the one she believed she had under control, was already beginning to come apart at the seams, and she didn't even know it. The days after her so-called business trip passed in a strange, almost surreal blur. I moved through them quietly, watching from the sidelines as Emily began to flail, scrambling to hold together the pieces of the life she had so carelessly torn apart. She hadn't yet realized that the walls closing in on her weren't the result of bad luck or coincidence. They were the inevitable collapse of the world she had built on lies. Her career, her social circle, her picture-perfect marriage, all of it was buckling under the weight of her own choices. I, on the other hand, was steady, focused. For the first time in what felt like years, I felt a deep, unshakable sense of control. The man who had once trusted without question, who had been content to believe in appearances, was gone. That Jack no longer existed. In his place stood someone sharper, deliberate, and unwilling to let betrayal go unanswered. When Emily came back from that trip, the first few days were drenched in silence. We barely exchanged words. She was too busy trying to patch the holes in her public image, working late, making frantic phone calls, throwing herself into damage control. But it was pointless. The cracks in her polished facade were spreading faster than she could cover them, and people were beginning to notice. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, she walked in the door looking like a ghost of herself. The confident, self-assured Emily I had known was nowhere to be found. In her place was someone pale, exhausted, and radiating nervous energy. She barely looked at me as she set down her bag, her mind clearly consumed by the storm brewing outside our walls. Finally, she broke the silence. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice unsteady. "Things at work are getting worse. HR is looking into some allegations. People are whispering. I don't know how much longer I can hold this together." I studied her as she spoke, watching every twitch of her hands, every flicker in her eyes. There was no mistaking it, she was afraid. But what struck me most was that even now, with her world collapsing piece by piece, she still hadn't connected the dots. She had no idea where the unraveling had truly begun. She had no idea it was me, her once devoted, trusting husband, who had been pulling every string from the shadows. The anonymous tip to HR? That was mine. The damning photos and screenshots that mysteriously found their way into the right hands? Mine too. Emily believed some nameless enemy was targeting her, someone with a personal grudge who wanted to destroy her career and her reputation. The truth was far simpler. She had done this to herself. Every consequence she was facing was born from her own choices. I had only cleared the path for those consequences to find her. "You'll get through this, Emily," I told her one evening, my voice low and steady, almost gentle. "It's just a misunderstanding. Everything will work itself out." She looked at me then, desperation swimming in her eyes. But behind it I caught something else, a tiny, uncertain flicker. She wasn't convinced anymore. And for me, that single moment, that crack in her confidence, was the sweetest taste of victory I'd had yet. It was no longer just about proving her infidelity. It was about watching her crumble, piece by piece, as the full weight of her own actions pressed down on her. But my work wasn't finished. The next stage of my plan was aimed at Ethan, the man who had walked so casually into my marriage, believing he could take what wasn't his without consequence. I had already done my homework on him. I knew about the late-night poker games, the growing mountain of debt, the shady business deals that skirted the line between illegal and outright criminal. I could have confronted him directly, but that would have been too easy. No, what I wanted was for him to feel the pressure closing in, with no clear idea of where it was coming from. So, I made a few quiet phone calls. I reached out to some of the less reputable people he owed money to and shared a few details about his recent activities. I didn't need to issue threats or even speak to him at all. I knew the kind of men I had just tipped off, and I knew they would do all the work for me. It didn't take long before the squeeze began. Ethan started to feel the heat, and I was only getting started. I could see the change in him even without meeting him face to face. The stories Emily told me about Ethan had started to shift. Her tone still carried concern, but there was an edge of frustration creeping in. She was beginning to wonder, deep down, whether he was worth the chaos he brought into her life. His gambling debts were gnawing at him like a disease. The phone calls came at all hours. The threats grew bolder. And from what I knew of the men chasing him, the unannounced visits would only become more frequent and more aggressive. But the sweetest part? Watching Emily feel the weight of it too. She was starting to taste the consequences of her choices, not just in her own career and reputation, but in the mess her lover had dragged her into. One night, she came home looking even more drained than I'd ever seen her. Her makeup was smudged, her hair a mess, her hands trembling slightly as she paced the living room. "Jack, I need to talk to you," she blurted out, unable to sit still. "Ethan's in trouble. People are after him, he's getting these calls, these threats. Just bad, Jack. Really bad." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. It was almost too easy now. She stood there, caught between the fallout from her affair and the wreckage of her job, still blind to the fact that I had engineered every piece of it. "Do you think he'll be okay?" I asked softly, painting my face with a mask of concern. Inside, I was savoring every drop of her misery. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head, her voice cracking. "Everything's falling apart. My job, my relationship with Ethan. I just don't know what to do anymore." And that was when I knew I had her exactly where I wanted her. She didn't just think she was losing control, she was. Completely. She had no idea that every thread of her life was being cut by my hand. She had no idea that the chaos she thought was bad luck was in fact the meticulous result of my planning. The cruelest part? She still believed she was the victim in all of this. But I wasn't done. The last move, the one I'd been saving, would be the most devastating of all: public exposure. Emily had always lived for her image, her reputation, her social circle, her career. That was her identity. And I knew that if I took all of that away, she would be left with nothing. I set up a brand new anonymous email account, taking my time to craft the perfect message. Every word was deliberate, every sentence a careful mix of fact and suggestion. It was addressed to all of her closest friends, her colleagues, and her family. In that email, I didn't hold back. I attached the clearest photos of Emily and Ethan together, paired with carefully chosen excerpts from their text exchanges, the kind that left no room for doubt. I ended it with a simple, pointed line: "You deserve to know the truth." It didn't take long for the fuse to burn down. Within hours, Emily's phone lit up like a storm: calls, messages, endless notifications. Friends texted her, some demanding explanations, others outright accusing her. Her mother called, sobbing into the receiver, asking how she could have done something like this. The whispers spread fast. By the time she walked through the door that evening, the scandal had already consumed her world. She stood in front of me, her cheeks flushed with equal parts fury and humiliation. "Did you do this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Did you send those photos? Did you ruin my life?" I met her gaze, my expression calm, almost unreadable. "Why would I do that, Emily?" I asked quietly. "I didn't even know you were seeing someone else." Something in her eyes shifted then. For the first time I saw it: real fear. The kind of fear that comes when a person finally realizes they've underestimated someone they thought they knew. Her voice broke. "I can explain. I made a mistake, Jack. A huge mistake." I shook my head, my tone steady. "No, Emily. You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. And now you're living with the consequences." Her composure shattered. She sank onto the couch, face buried in her hands, sobs shaking her shoulders. But the time for sympathy had passed. There was no redemption left for her. Not from me, and not from the world she had so carefully built. From there, her life unraveled at a speed even I hadn't anticipated. Her company terminated her employment, citing violations of ethical conduct. Ethan vanished without a word, unwilling, or unable, to stand beside her in the wreckage. Friends who had once hung on her every word began to step back, eager to avoid being pulled into her scandal. By the time the dust began to settle, Emily was left with no allies, no support system. At home she barely spoke. The woman who had once filled every room with her vibrant presence was now a hollow shell, a ghost of the life she'd destroyed with her own hands. The woman I had once loved now moved through the house like a shadow, silent, hollow, weighed down by the ghosts of her own decisions. And truthfully, I felt nothing for her anymore. The final act in all of this was the divorce. But I wasn't about to settle for a clean break that left her with anything she could cling to. No, this was going to be thorough. She had taken everything I had worked for, and now it was my turn to take it all back. My attorney, Lauren, was meticulous. Every clause, every term, every potential loophole was closed in my favor. The financial settlement, the property division, even the custody arrangements. Lauren made sure there was nothing left for Emily to leverage. She wouldn't walk away with a dime she hadn't earned herself. When the day came, I stepped into Lauren's office, signed the final documents, and slid them across the table without hesitation. Just like that, it was over. Emily never saw it coming. She had spent so long believing she held the power, that she controlled the board. But in the end, I was the one who delivered the checkmate. Walking out of that office, I carried with me a truth I would never forget. Never underestimate the man who has nothing left to lose. Watching her life continue to unravel in the aftermath brought a certain cold satisfaction. The woman who once seemed untouchable was crumbling in plain sight. She spent hours glued to her phone, trying to salvage friendships, begging for second chances at work, scrambling to stitch together the remains of her social standing. But the cracks in her perfect image were no longer cracks, they were gaping fractures. Her hair, once styled to perfection, now fell in uneven strands. Her makeup, usually flawless, was smudged and faded. The confident posture she used to command was gone. Her clothes hung loosely on her, like they belonged to someone else entirely. One evening, I stood in the doorway and watched her sit at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her phone as if willing it to deliver some kind of salvation. It didn't. And I knew then, it was time. Time to cut the last thread connecting us. I had been preparing for this moment for months, quietly, patiently, making sure every detail was in place. And now the time had come. Without a word, I slid a manila folder across the kitchen table toward her. She looked down, confused, then back up at me, her brows knitting together. What is this? Divorce papers, I said, my voice colder and steadier than I'd expected. It's over, Emily. Her hands trembled as she opened the folder, scanning the documents like they were written in a language she didn't understand. You can't be serious, Jack. Please, can we talk about this? There's nothing to talk about, I replied, my tone flat, immovable. You made your choices. Now you get to live with them. Tears slid down her cheeks, but they stirred nothing in me, not the sympathy I once might have felt, not even the bitterness I'd carried for so long. There was only a hollow finality. I knew she wasn't crying out of remorse for what she'd done to me. She was crying because she was losing everything, her marriage, her comfort, her sense of control. The divorce process moved quickly, just as I had planned. Lauren, my attorney and steadfast ally, made certain the settlement left Emily with next to nothing. By the time she realized what was happening, it was too late. The assets that had once been ours had already been transferred into accounts under my sole control, untouchable. The evidence of her affair was undeniable, and I leveraged it for all it was worth. In the end, I walked away with the house, the savings, and nearly every significant asset we had accumulated together. Emily, on the other hand, was left with a mountain of debt. Her unemployment benefits barely covered her basic living expenses, and thanks to the scandal, she couldn't find work in her field. No one wanted the baggage that came with hiring her. And Ethan, the man she had gambled everything for? Gone. Disappeared without a trace. No one knew where he had gone, though. I had a strong suspicion about where Ethan had gone. More than likely, he was running from the very creditors I'd quietly pointed in his direction. Emily tried calling him again and again, but each attempt ended in silence. The man she had believed would be her escape, her salvation, had left her stranded, forcing her to face the fallout entirely on her own. By the time the divorce was finalized, her life was barely recognizable. She had traded our spacious home for a cramped, dingy one-bedroom apartment on the far edge of town, a world away from the comfort and status she once flaunted. The polished, vibrant woman I had once known was gone. Her hair hung limp, her clothes were tired and worn, and her eyes had lost the spark that used to light up every room she entered. One afternoon she stood in front of me, her voice barely more than a whisper. I'm sorry. For everything. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But please, can we try again? I'll do anything. I studied her for a long moment. And for the first time in months I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel anything. The woman before me wasn't the Emily I had married. That woman had been replaced long ago by someone who lied, betrayed, and believed she could get away with it. I simply shook my head. No. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild. The house, once filled with the noise, arguments, and restless energy of our marriage, had fallen into a deep, calming silence. For the first time in years, I could actually hear myself think. The emptiness that had once felt like a weight pressing on my chest slowly gave way to something lighter, peace. I started rediscovering pieces of myself I had neglected. I played my guitar again, spending quiet evenings lost in music. I returned to woodworking, my hands shaping something new from raw, unformed pieces. I made choices without compromise, living life on my own terms for the first time in what felt like forever. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. I thought I'd never hear from her again. But one morning there it was, an envelope sitting in my mailbox with her handwriting on it. I opened the envelope and read the letter twice before setting it down. Jack, it began. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to say this. I'm sorry, not just for the affair but for taking you for granted. You were a good husband and I threw it all away for something meaningless. I know I can't undo the damage I've caused, but I hope that one day you can forgive me. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in the back of a drawer. There was no rush of anger, no surge of satisfaction, no lingering bitterness. Just nothing. The chapter had already closed. It was time to start fresh, far from the ghosts of the past. Thanks to the assets I had secured in the divorce, I had the freedom to choose where I wanted my life to begin again. I chose a small town in the Pacific Northwest, a place I'd always dreamed of calling home. The air there was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and rain. The mountains stood watch in the distance, and the quiet streets seemed to hum with peace. For the first time in years I felt truly at ease. I found a simple job at the local hardware store, the kind where people actually learned your name. I started volunteering at a community center, helping with repairs and odd jobs. I even adopted a dog, a scruffy mutt with mismatched ears who quickly became my closest companion. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. It was real. Every now and then, a thought of Emily would drift through my mind, not with longing or resentment, but as a reminder of how far I'd come. She had shown me the depth of betrayal people are capable of. But in the end, she had also shown me something else, the strength I didn't know I had until I was forced to rebuild from the ground up. And I was finally living on my own terms.